Welcome to the Workshop Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, and joining me today is my second most famous Australian I've ever had on, Mr. Nev Jones, psychologist, combat veteran, and green woodworker. Welcome to the show, Nev. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Andrew. I don't know, but second most famous, so clearly I'm the second Australian because there's nothing famous about me. But yeah, so I'm a psychologist over here in Australia. I live in a sort of town called Tamborine Mountain in the hinterland in the mountains behind the Gold Coast here. Before being a psychologist, I spent 20 years in the Australian Army, including numerous tours of Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor. I wasn't a psychologist then. I was doing other things in the military, but I sort of retrained at the end of my career. And I now specialise in working with veterans and first responders in the mental health space there. And I also started a social enterprise arm to my psychology practice called Halcyon Woodcraft, which is on Instagram. And we offer free hand tool woodworking programs with a mental health focus, and they're available to veterans, first responders, and people with disabilities in the community. And it's going great guns at the moment.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's probably quite a demand for that. Just once people figure out that hey, this is a thing that I can access. Imagine you don't have any issues trying to convince people to participate.
No, not at all. There's a strong interest in that, and it's funny. It's one of those things that I think our healthcare system can do better at listening to. The fact that there is a demand for that suggests that there is a need for that, but it doesn't necessarily make accessing things like what I do easy for people as well, because we work in a very rigid healthcare system as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that, excuse me, it's something that it's interesting. I was reading through I guess I should maybe do a little bit of an intro of why you're even on the show here.
Yeah, of course.
So I reached out to the guys at the Mortis and Tenon magazine and podcast, and just to kind of see if they would be interested in coming on here and talking about a return to craft and how that benefits people's mental health. And they said, well, we don't really have time, but here's Nev Jones's contact information, and he just completed this. Looks like it was pretty awesome to be able to do this Winston Churchill Trust thing. So that's a fellowship in Australia, is it? Where they?
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I'll speak about that. Absolutely. Yeah. So I've just finished my fellowship last year. What it is, it's when Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, wartime Prime Minister, when he died, a fellowship was started in his honour. And basically, they fund social research trips, for want of a better term. They where if there's a particular issue that benefits society, you can apply for a fellowship, and they will sponsor it. And it involves sponsoring overseas travel. So their motto is learn globally, inspire locally. So it's all about traveling abroad and meeting with people, talking with people, learning off people around the world in your particular field, and then bringing that knowledge back to Australia, and importantly, disseminating that for the benefit of society back here. So, and it's not a woodworking thing. It's not a mental health thing. It could be any facet of society. There's government professionals. There's legal professionals. There's artists. There's any and every sort of field that might benefit society that can apply for these fellowships. And I was fortunate to be awarded one, which saw me travel to Japan, the US, England, Sweden, Latvia, and Scotland over about 8 months last summer. And I met with a range of stakeholders, including professional woodworkers, researchers, mental health professionals, charities, and the like. And my project was specifically investigating the mental health benefits of green woodworking for veterans in therapeutic settings. So I got to meet with some wonderful people, and it evolved my thinking on this topic. And now I'm in what I would describe as the dissemination phase, where I'm applying all of those learnings into not only the work I do, but the advocacy work I do in campaigning for change in the way that we approach mental health treatment and well-being issues for veterans as well. And I guess that's what brings me here, and that's what ultimately connected me to you.
Yeah, and that was like, there's a little part of me that's like, that would be awesome. I'd be jealous. So were you traveling for the whole 8 months, or was it like out here and then back and then out for a day and then back out for a day and back?
So it was 8 weeks, sorry, not 8 months. I don't know
Oh,
if I
eight
said
weeks.
8 months, but it was so it was about 2 months. But it was conceptually what they support you to do is a one directional trip. So it's a round the world trip. So it was 8 weeks on the road. So a little bit tricky administratively to sort of join the dots and to make everything line up. And some of the driving forces behind my schedule was attending a couple of key events. So I was in the US attending, attending Hand Tool Haven, which is a fundraising event by Plain Wellness over there. Jamie Harpster was a really, really big sort of advocate and supporter of what I do here. So I had to align that. And there was a couple of green woodworking events in the UK, which were really invaluable for me. Spoonfest and Spoontown, which allowed me to meet a whole heap of stakeholders in the one location there. Sweden, I went to Talgfest over there, which is one of the biggest sort of green woodworking events in Sweden as well. So I had to sort of synchronize all of these things and try to schedule meetings with other people in and around that as well. So yeah, so one big trip, and yeah, doing
It
that.
was hectic, but long enough to still be enjoyable too, it sounds like.
Yeah. The good thing about these fellowships is there's an expectation that you'll also schedule some downtime in and amongst all of that as well. Eight weeks is a long time to be on the road, and you can't be engaged in meetings and report writing and all of that for 8 weeks straight because you burn yourself out pretty quick and you'll sort of lose some of the benefit of it. So it's important to have, relaxation days, I suppose, built in that. So for me, I'm a big hiker. I love nature, and a big sort of part of what I do is about nature based stuff, and that's reflected in the green woodworking I do. So for me, what I did for that is I built in day-long hikes in each of the locations that I visited over there. So I spent some wonderful time in the Shenandoah National Park in the US, and around Maine up in the northeast. I did some really wonderful walks in the UK and Sweden. I fell in love with. I made sure to incorporate those times, those recreational times in there as well.
Imagine that was just thinking about Sweden versus like creeping on some of the pictures of Tambourine Mountain. I imagine Sweden and Tambourine Mountain are wildly different from each other as far as landscape goes.
Very, very different. I spent one of the most amazing days of all of the things I did. I did some incredible things in this trip in this 8 weeks. Visited some incredible places, met some incredible people. One of my favorite days I spent in Sweden was just a day in the forest picking berries. And here we go. Like in Australia, we pay a ridiculous amount of money to buy blueberries and raspberries and things like that, which don't grow well over here, which taste garbage because of the climate over here. And there I was in Sweden in the forest picking these there's these blueberries that are growing like weeds in the forest in there in Sweden, and they're so sweet and juicy. And here we are chewing on a blueberry over here in Australia, which we've paid $15 for a small punnet of them, and they taste like chewing a piece of leather. And then here I am just picking these wild berries over there. It was just incredible. It's like a different planet over there. And it was such an amazing day walking through these pine forests over there. And here in Australia, like, don't get me wrong, there's beautiful forest here in Australia, just very different. A lot more eucalypts over here, and just it's just different. Yeah, it's just different and just amazing.
Well, we were talking a little bit in the pre-show about how where we live and the differences. I guess I could add a little bit to the fuel to the fire of jealousy going on here, because just over here, just outside of my house, about 30 yards, I've got some not even that, maybe 15 meters or so away from the house, got trees there, and right along that tree there's a big wild blueberry patch. And then all through all of those trees, there's a whole bunch of wild raspberries, and I don't know if you know what Saskatoons are or not, but there's just another
No,
wild berry they're kind of like a blueberry-ish, a
okay.
little bit different, but yeah,
Yeah.
there's I think I've found 5 different species of wild berries just kind of growing in the trees over here within 100 yards of my house,
Yeah, that's incredible. That
which
does
is
make
lovely.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyway, back to what's actually you're talking about, instead of just bragging about how wonderful my I got to make myself feel a little bit better, because as most people who listen to the podcast know, I'm building the house.
Yeah.
I'm in bare stud stage in a lot of the house and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So the little wins are important.
Absolutely. Absolutely they are.
Anyway, over here in your, I was reading your reading your report that you wrote for the Churchill Trust thing, and you kind of reiterated a few times in it where there's no real evidence for the mental health effects of green woodworking specifically. And I would say in my personal research, there's not a whole lot of evidence for handcraft in general being beneficial to mental health. I mean, there's some anecdotal stuff, but nothing really like there's no gold standard research by any means.
No, yeah, you're spot on. Absolutely right. It's funny. That's probably the reason that we that we function in a healthcare system that doesn't sort of accommodate these sort of things. It's because it's not that these things are not relevant or beneficial and things like that. It's just the absence of evidence-based research. That's the issue there, and that's one of the things that I advocate for is the investment of that. There is a bit coming out now out of Europe and England and the like. But there's absolutely scope for many a PhD or research project behind all of this stuff. Yeah. So if there's any budding psychologists or researchers out there that are interested, we can definitely.
It's my wife. So my wife is just completing her master's in special education and autism, and obviously I just finished mine, and we're both sitting here at this point of like, do we go on and do PhDs as well, or is this like, do we pull back and be decent parents for a few years first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a PhD into like that handcraft health connection would definitely be appealing to me. So if anybody does listen to this who could sponsor that, I would 100% be interested. But anyway.
Yeah.
I liked in your report there, you said something to the effect of just because there's no evidence doesn't mean it's not the lack of evidence doesn't indicate the lack of efficacy. It's just the lack of writing down the proof. And so in this trip, in your report, you mentioned several of the people specifically do green woodworking and spoon carving and stuff like that because of anxiety and because of depression. Have you found that in your practice, the way you're doing that is the case?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, as a psychologist, obviously I measure the effects of that through my practice and the benefit of that. So absolutely. I guess I should just provide a bit of a background as to why and how I incorporate some of this into the work I do. So I guess a lot of the work that I do is with veterans and first responders. I do a lot of community work as well, but my bread and butter is probably veterans and first responders. And what I found operating as a psychologist is that I was doing the therapy in that sort of typical, stereotypical sort of way where we're sitting in an office with four walls around us. I'm sitting face to face with somebody who maybe does or does not want to be there, certainly doesn't know me. And there's an expectation that they will just speak openly to me about sort of what's going on. And that's really, really bloody hard. So I found that there was this barrier there that to me didn't need to be there, because we do know that there's therapeutic benefit in being outdoors and that there's other ways, there's other ways of doing things. And yet there is this expectation that that's how I will do it. I'll have these 50-minute sessions sitting there in a room face to face with somebody, because that's the system, the healthcare system that we work in. And I'm sitting there getting frustrated over time with this. And I've got people feeling uncomfortable that I'm working with. I'm feeling just as uncomfortable, wishing I could sort of be sitting outside and whatever. So, that sort of got to a point where I started introducing basic hand tool woodworking activities in those sessions to help break that down. So we do a little bit of sort of basic things within obviously safety constraints. So a bit of carving, a bit of simple whittling, carving a set of chopsticks or doing a bit of spoon carving. So nothing too onerous, but just those physical activities, getting the hands moving, changing that point of focus from my eyes to not a third person, but almost like a third thing in the room where they could, our collective focus could shift to that. It just allowed people to break down that tension that existed in the room, and just that physical movement got the juices flowing with communication and emotional connection and stuff. And I started doing those sort of things. That got to a point where I had clients asking me saying, hey, I feel a bit suffocated in this room. Can we just go and sit out under that tree and do this? So I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I'm all about that. So we'd sort of find ourselves drifting outside a little bit as well. So we'd start using it as this way of just relaxing and connecting on that level. And it's evolved over time. And that sort of ultimately led to me starting Halcyon Woodcraft because because I found that there was barriers in place with our government sort of healthcare model, which didn't allow me to sort of function as well as I could in that sort of situation. So I started running free hand tool woodworking program where I wasn't confined by those 50-minute sessions and stuff where we'll spend a half a day or a full day doing on projects and stuff like that. I can be led by where the client's at with their communication and things like that. So yeah, so we started running these projects there, and what I found is that people responded incredibly well to that. So people were reporting, improved mood, reduced anxiety, increased enthusiasm with life, and a sense of meaning and purpose in what they were doing, and an increased sense of competence and confidence in what they were doing. So of course, all of those things are wonderful. And now I guess we've come almost full circle with that, where now I'm in the sort of throes of designing in Australia over here, we've got what we call the Medicare system, which is our government healthcare system, which offers subsidised healthcare system. You'll have to forgive me, I'm not familiar with the Canadian equivalent, but that our system offers a maximum of 10 subsidised sessions with a psychologist in a calendar year. So I'm designing a green woodworking program that meets the requirements of that system, so I can offer this to clients, maybe in a small group setting or an individual setting. And that's a bit more difficult than you would imagine, actually, to make it fit the system. But it's working, and I'm determined to make it work.
Well, I'd imagine, yeah, like psychology isn't covered under. Well, yeah. So Canada's healthcare system, we have a universal healthcare system that is, it's taxpayer subsidized, I guess. But psychology is one of those, like, is it covered or is it not covered? It is accessible through the healthcare system, but then it's also not, so there are quite a few people who have like extended healthcare benefits that'll cover it and stuff like that, which makes the rubber stamp end of it is probably easier. I'm sure for you, there's probably a whole bunch of like paperwork requirements that you have to do right, and you have to have a certain number of client contact minutes or hours per session or whatever, right? That type of stuff. Is that kind of the thing you're confronting, or?
Yeah, absolutely. There's compliance things. So there's certain therapy modes that that are approved, and others that are not, which I'm fully on board with, by the way, because that's the evidence based. What we do as professionals need to be evidence based. But it's but there is sort of some policy constraints around that about where, like for example, as a Medicare provider, my Medicare provider number is linked to my EFTPOS machine, which is in the office, sort of thing. So there's a presumption that when you conduct these things, it'll be in your office. So if I want to conduct something off-site, whether it's in a local council park or a national park or something like that, I need to sort of work around those sort of issues. So, there's some pragmatic things like that need to be worked through to be compliant from an auditing perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's always the problem, is the bureaucrats who are like, well, that's not how it's supposed to be done.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
In your report here, you mentioned, I think it's in your report, or maybe it's on your website. I don't remember now where I read it, but you mentioned that your waiting room is now just like a hand tool wood shop.
Yes, it was. I've recently moved out of there, and I've moved into a different premises. But yeah, that's an interesting sort of anecdote there, that when I was on this path of introducing this handcraft into my therapy, what I found, and one of the things that always bugged me when I sort of transitioned to be a psychologist, is the fact that I would be working with people. They'd be sitting in my waiting room, and this is this really industrialized approach to healthcare that we have, where I will have a conga line of people waiting to see me. There'll be people sitting in the waiting room feeling deeply uncomfortable and very anxious because they know that they're about to talk to me about stuff that they don't really want to talk about. So they'll be sitting there stewing in their own anxiety in this waiting room, which was very typical. There was a reception desk sitting there. There was motivational posters on the wall, which people don't read or don't respond to.
There's the magazines that are 2 years out of date sitting on the...
Exactly. Think of hand sanitizer, whatever. And I thought, well, they're sitting there waiting. they're getting more anxious as a result of their waiting. They're a captive audience there, so why not make that a more therapeutic experience for them? So what I did, I went out on a limb and I sort of I gutted it because I didn't like that sort of waiting room. So I removed all of the furniture. I built a purpose-built workbench for it, and I put it in there. I filled it with, vintage and antique hand tools, a couple of, scrap pieces of wood in there, a couple of half-finished projects, a couple of full-finished projects, just so people can get that sensory engagement in there. So then they would walk into that waiting room there, and the first thing that they will experience is the scent of this wood that's in there. That's indescribable smell of wood there, whether it's the pine or the camphor laurel or whatever it is in there, and they'll go, "Oh wow, that's actually smelling this natural product, not some artificial sanitizer that's in there." And people reported to be like, "Oh, this smells really nice in there," and then they'd have the opportunity to walk around the workbench, pick up a hand plane, just plane a piece of wood. Get that sensory stimulation of that crunch that we all love, that crunch of the hand plane there, that sense that they're achieving something around them. They could physically shake off this anxiety through physical movement as well in there, and the feedback I got was just amazing. People were going, "This is amazing," because I was worried before I did that. I was worried, would this be too jarring? Would this be something that people wouldn't sort of be attracted to? But what I found is that people loved it, and I'm talking across demographics as well. It's not just middle-aged men wearing flannel or that were responding to it. I'm talking about women were responding to it, kids were responding to it, elderly people were responding to it, because it was just something different and something to stimulate those senses. So what I was finding from a therapeutic benefit is that they were then coming into sessions in a reduced anxious state. So the start point for our talk therapy sessions was much better because they weren't going in there in this highly aroused state. So they were more receptive to, the talk therapy after that. And 100% of the feedback that I got, the anecdotal feedback, was that is a much more therapeutically beneficial setting than the sterile waiting room. Yeah. So that was incredible. Yeah. That morphed over time. I've since moved out of that rented premises, and I now work from my home location. I've got a cabin built in our front yard. We live on a acreage here, and I work out of my home shop for the practical work. So yeah, so we've taken it to another level with where we are now.
Sounds like to me what's going on here is you found a good way to turn your hobbies into like a tax write-off. I had to buy these new tools because they're necessary for the therapy.
Yeah, not only a tax write-off, but so I can get the tick of approval from my wife as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's for the clients.
Yeah. Well, see, the clients, it's like, I was actually a friend of mine, a psychologist. He was trying to convince his boss that they should buy a fishing boat because he figured that they'd be able to do more therapeutic good fishing with these clients than just sitting in there in the talk therapy. And I wonder if that's kind of the same, sensory modalities, getting out into nature and stuff like that really does affect people.
I 100% think it is, and I guess the background or the I guess my thesis behind this whole thing is around biophilia. Have you heard of the concept of biophilia at all?
Yep.
So it's something that I am all across, and I'll speak about this for hours, but I firmly believe that we, in this post-industrial sort of information age that we live in, that we live in a perpetual state of stress where we're carrying around, I say we, I mean Western society in particular, but probably everybody across the world, in this elevated state of baseline stress as a consequence of how we live. And if we sort of picture a graph and how we live now compared to how we lived just say 200 or 300 years ago, from a physiological perspective, it really hasn't changed. We look exactly the same as we did 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Our body and our minds and needs haven't changed. So if we were to graph that change over time, it's very linear and it's very flat. It hasn't changed much at all. But if we were to sort of overlay a graph of how we live our life over the last 200 or 300 years, it has changed exponentially over there for that time. if we compare the way we live our life, which is very flat compared to, how our body wants to live and what our body's needs are, it's very flat. But if we overlay how we actually live our life, we're deviating from what our body needs quite a bit. And we get this exponential graph happening there. So it leaves what I call this biophilic delta there, this gap that exists between how we live our life and how our body wants us to live our life. And that's why we see phenomenon like since the COVID times or during the COVID times, we saw this surge, this population shift away from urban centres to more regional and rural areas. I'm sure you saw that over there. We certainly saw that here in Australia. We saw this surge in things like handcraft and traditional craft and things like that. Even sort of, some of the movements that we see these days with, outdoor therapy, people taking up running and trail running and things like that. We call it paddock to plate over here. I'm sure it's a similar sort of term over there. This urge to eat healthier and have this connection with the food I eat. All of those things are driven by this biophilic delta in our body communicating to us that we want to bridge that gap. We want to live our life a little bit closer to how it wants to live and how it's genetically designed to live. Now, I guess my thesis behind this is that we need to listen to that voice. We need to give it a seat at our decision-making table whenever we're making any types of decisions, whether it's decisions about what am I putting in my body from a food perspective? What am I putting on my body from a clothing perspective? What am I feeding my brain from an information perspective? All of those things. What am I doing with my hands? What am I doing with that time that I have in my life? And if we can, and of course, there's a lot of factors at play that, I'm not advocating for all of us going and living in the wilderness and living like cavemen. The reality is we live in this world that we live in, and that's okay. There's many wonderful things that come with us with that, but we still need to listen to that voice. Yeah.
A lot less people dying at 30 years old from dysentery is one of the benefits.
Yeah, 100% increased lifespan and healthcare and all of that. So, so all of that's wonderful, right? But we do live in this. So my argument is that if we were to give that biophilic voice a seat at our decision-making table, if I'm making a decision, for example, about, what new car do I make? What new car do I buy? Maybe I want to consider that, maybe I might have some values around, I don't know, environmental things or something, or practical things that I need a car to fit lumber in the back or whatever it might be. But taking that into consideration, what we can do ultimately is reduce that baseline level of stress in our life. If I'm making a decision about what I do on the weekend, if I could sit in front of the TV and I could watch a whole heap of TV shows about whatever, that'll give me a short dopamine fix, yeah, but is it actually beneficial to bridging this biophilic delta? Am I better off getting in my woodshop and building something? Am I better off going for a walk outside? So giving it a voice at the table in all decisions in our life allows us to reduce our baseline stress and anxiety in our life, which gives us more room, I suppose, in our body. So if we envisage our body as a bucket which contains all of our stress and anxiety, if we can reduce that baseline level that doesn't need to be there, it leaves more space in the top to deal with the situational stresses in our life, whether it's financial, grief related, whatever it might be. So it frees that up. So I guess that's the thesis that underpins everything that I do in this.
Yeah, it kind of just thinking about what we were talking there, I started to think about, you hear a lot of people who like, oh, I do this for self-care, right? Like, I'm going to go to the restaurant for self-care, or so I'm going to watch a TV because I deserve it and I need self-care. And I think often we confuse self-care with self-indulgence.
Yes.
Like we take, like, going to a restaurant, sitting down and watching TV all day long isn't necessarily self-care. Self-care is something that will build you up in some way.
Yeah.
The self-indulgence is when you're sitting down and eating too much chocolate and watching a movie. And I wonder how much like that self-care part of getting out, like you said, that the biophilic voice in your head there is crying out for some fresh air. Yeah. That's the self-care choice that we need to recognize, and making some of those choices based on, like, I know I need to feed that voice. I wonder how much that affects your downstream decision making, like decision fatigue that people get trapped into with that, I have 100 decisions today. If I make it with the like you said, the biophilic voice in mind, I wonder how much that would change decision fatigue, because you're automatically going, well, I'm not going to make this decision because it doesn't align with this value that I've assigned to myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you could be onto something then. That interesting what you say about self-indulgence versus self-care. I'd argue that self-care can be hard work sometimes, quite often, and it's it can be a fine line sometimes. But I would suggest that self-indulgent is probably always the easy option. But self-care might be easy sometimes, but quite often self-care is hard work. Doing the right thing is hard work. You know, picking up a picking up a piece of wood and making a box out of this with hand tools is hard work. You'll work up a sweat, but ultimately at the end of that, you will have something beautiful, and it will sort of fill your bucket in a whole bunch of different ways. Sitting in front of the TV all weekend and watching mind-numbing stuff on TV, it'll give you that quick dopamine fix. Absolutely, it'll make you feel good this afternoon. Is there any longer-term benefit in that? Is it really good for me, or am I just getting that sort of quick dopamine fix that society's really good at feeding us?
I wonder if maybe like going to our pre-show. Here's the plug for the pre-show. Go listen to the pre-show. In our pre-show conversation, we talked a little bit about like the existential crisis of not knowing how to do things,
Mm.
right? And I wonder if like you said like you get that dopamine hit from watching TV, but the other side of that dopamine hit is the dark side of that is, like I don't look like a movie star. And here I watch all of these people on who all look fabulous, and they can, I mean, even if you just go like woodworking specific, they
Yeah,
can build a piece of furniture in a 20-minute show that looks phenomenal, even though
yeah,
it's probably actually made out of styrofoam and paint. But, on the
yes,
TV screen, it looks great. And then they look fabulous, and they had time to run out to the gym and work out and blah, 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 blah. I wonder if that feeds that existential crisis of look at the people on the TV you're doing so good. I mean, we all know that social media is bad for your mental health.
yeah,
If you're, especially if you're getting trapped into that comparison cycle, but
yeah.
then the self-care component of taking back some control for yourself of, hey, I do have self-efficacy. I am able to make something. I am able to do it, and recognizing that maybe it's not perfect, but I have the ability to create. I have the ability to connect.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right that short-term dopamine fix thing can breed that learned helplessness that people can have, and that can induce or promote depression in people and things like that as well. So yeah, it's absolutely a challenge, and I think creativity is a wonderful outlet to demonstrate what I call competence, and that I wrote about in that Churchill Fellowship report as well. So one of the messages that that I communicate to people that do workshops with me is that by them being here with me, by them investing a half day or a full day with me, that's the participants I'm talking about, they are making the world a better place by the investment of their time. So they will, whether it's making a spoon or whether it's making a box, whatever it might be, and they may never have picked up a tool in their life, and that's okay. The reality is they will have created something out of a scrap bit of wood, like carving a spoon, for example, a piece of wood which has been pruned off a tree somewhere, which was destined to be a wood chip or firewood or whatever. They have carved something, and it might not be technically the best spoon, the most beautiful spoon ever made. It might lack symmetry. It might have rough edges or whatever. But you know what? It can scoop stuff out. You can feed your family with that. It's a beautiful thing. It has a purpose. It has functionality. It can be, it's got pragmatic purposes, and it's a beautiful thing because it is capturing, from an artistic perspective, I suppose, it is capturing where you are in that moment. So it is a reflection of your emotional state, your confidence, your ability at the moment, your experience with these tools. And yeah, that might not be perfect, but you know what? It's a reflection of where you are at this point in time, and that is a beautiful thing. So, and you can take this home and you can feed your family with it. And you know what? Your grandchildren can pick that up in, I don't know, 50, 100 years' time, whatever. They can pick that spoon up and they can feel that imperfections. They can feel, the asymmetry that exists in that. But you know what? They won't look at that through a judgmental lens. They won't look at that and say, well, this is a piece of crap spoon. They'll pick it up and go, wow, this is actually a beautiful thing. I can see the humanity in that. Just like we do when we pick up antique, whether it's a tool or an object or whatever, we'll feel it, we'll touch it, we'll look at it, we'll reflect on where this person was at that time when they made it, and we love it. You know, it makes us, it sort of tickles us when we have those thoughts, right? So our future generations will think that, so they will see the beauty that exists in that spoon. So by us having that mindset when we go into this project that we are communicating to future generations, it builds this sense of competence. We're bringing beauty into the world. We are growing through this creative process. So it can be really a powerful thing that we bring into it. Yeah. So that's the message I try to get across before we even touch a tool in the workshops that we run.
I'm curious if you've had any feedback regarding like I've made a spoon. Does that in the future become then a grounding object for them as well? Like they get into like, I'm feeling stressed, blah blah blah, and oh, there's my spoon. Remember, bring you back to this moment where you feel a little bit calmer again.
Yeah, can I use a real time example for that? And this will be a bit of a heavy conversation. I sort of just put a warning out there first before I start talking about this. But last year, over the last couple of years, I was working with a police officer up here, a police officer with chronic PTSD as a consequence of their service as a police officer, exposure to daily trauma and things like that. So they had a diagnosis of PTSD and major depression. I was working with them for probably, must have been close to 2 years in the end in psychotherapy, doing both trauma-focused talk therapy, but also they also participated in various workshops that I did, including spoon carving workshops. This police officer disclosed to me about midway through our treatment that they were experiencing strong suicidal thoughts, and that they were self-harming as well, and they were cutting themselves. So as part of the safety plan that we implemented for that police officer, is I gave them back a spoon that we worked on in a spoon carving workshop. And the plan that we agreed on was that when they were feeling suicidal, rather than reaching for a knife to cut themselves, I wanted them to reach for this spoon and I wanted them to feel that spoon. I wanted them to, from a mindfulness perspective, feel the imperfections on that spoon, feel the grain of the wood, feel the little bits of where we weren't perfect in carving. Feel the knife marks, feel the chip marks. Feel those imperfections, feel that asymmetry there, and let that take you back to a place of calm where we were when we were making that spoon, right? So that's what we agreed upon. They would go back to that spoon and reach for that spoon rather than reaching the knives. So they did that over a period of time, right? And then one day later on in the piece, I was working with this police officer, and they arrived with that spoon and they gave that spoon back to me. And the police officer said to me, I want to give this spoon back to you because I don't need it anymore. I don't need it anymore because I'm not reaching for it anymore. I don't need it in my life, and basically, I want you to keep it as essentially as a souvenir for what you do here. And that was the last session that I saw with that person. They had come to the conclusion that the grounding nature of that spoon that they've been using for that period of time was hugely successful to the point where they were no longer suicidal and didn't need it anymore. So that was incredibly powerful for me when they returned that object, it was more than a spoon, right? It wasn't about the spoon. It was about the emotions and the value and the worth of that spoon and the role that it played in this person's life, to the point where they were like, oh, I'm not suicidal anymore. I don't need this, and I'm gonna continue with my life without that spoon. Yeah. So that was just a powerful anecdote of how those things can be really sort of meaningful to people.
Yeah, and like the transition, I'm sure that on your part, it probably felt like an incredible gift almost to receive something that obviously just that thing was a powerful thing for them to go through their journey, and then here they're giving it to you as a symbol of your help for them as well. Then
I have to say it is probably one of the, I'm sitting here in my shop at the moment as I speak to you. I'm surrounded by tools and things that I've made and things like that, but that spoon is probably one of, if not the most prized things that I have at the moment. Yeah, so it means much more to me than just a spoon as well. And I'm not giving that to anyone in the future. That's mine. Unless we need it, of course. I'm more than happy to pull it out for any future people that need it. But it's a loan. It's not a gift. That's always the condition.
I think that I think that speaks to kind of like the story of handcraft, though, right? Like there's no soul. Like you can buy a wooden spoon that's been CNC machined out and even machined to have some imperfections or whatever, but there's no soul to it. You know, like there's no story in it.
Yeah.
Whereas this spoon, like every time you grab it, it reminds you of the hero's journey. You know, like the descent into darkness and the recovery and moving on with a new perspective and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It really encapsulates all of that, and that's really the message I get across to people in these workshops. That you're making this thing today, and you're making it for you now. But you know what? You also have a responsibility to future generations because you're communicating your story in this as well. So I don't want it. We're not going to use an electric sander or a CNC machine to make this spoon, or we're not going to knock out a template of 100 spoons that are identical. If you want a spoon, you can buy one from $1 down, the store down the road. But I want a spoon that tells a story, and more specifically, I want a spoon that tells your story, that captures where you are now at this point in time, for better or for worse, warts and all. This is where you are now. And then we need to find value. We need to find beauty there, because it's the human experience, isn't it? Wherever we are on any given day, it might be painful one day, it might be beautiful another day, but that is the human experience, and that's a gift. That's a gift that we have as humans that other animals don't, that we can recognize that. So we capture that on this day. We find value in that. We find beauty in that. And then we recognize that that will be appreciated in future generations. Your child will be picking this up. Your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will pick up this spoon or whatever it is, and they'll say, wow, this is where my grandparent was at that moment in time. And that's beautiful. And it allows them to connect to where you are as well, just like we connect with antiques now.
Yeah. So in your biography, or again, maybe it was in your Churchill Trust paper, I don't remember again where I read it, but you said kind of as a consequence of your tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and East Timor, you came away with some PTSD as a result of that. Have you used this same process on yourself, like the same handcraft, hand tool, green woodworking, self-therapy?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I think yes, I did. I was pretty cooked when I left the military after 20 years. I sort of, if it was a marathon, I stumbled across the finish line, or I probably was dragged across the finish line, to be honest. So I wasn't in a great place when I finished up that career. I have always had an interest in making and creating. I think the creative parts of my brain were probably left dormant for a lot of years in the military. Moving house a lot. You just can't have a workshop. You can't. It's hard to engage in meaningful work where you don't have that sort of geographic place of stability. So I think that creative and that woodworking and making part of my brain had laid dormant. We had moved to our beautiful property here at that time, and I thought, well, now is the moment. I'm very much a behavioural based person. I'm a person that struggles I'm one of those people that struggles to sit in a therapy room or a doctor's surgery or whatever it is. My way of treating my well-being is by doing, and by getting off my bum and doing. So I set up my workshop over time. I sort of fell into this through. I've always been a bit of a romantic when it comes to antiques and stuff like that, and thinking and reminiscing about yesteryear. So I spent a bit of time restoring antiques, including antique tools that drifted naturally into using those tools to make stuff. I discovered this thing called green woodworking, this label that we put on what we used to call just living woodworking, which has become a bit of a thing recently, and I sort of fell into that space, and I found that it actually was useful to me. Did I deliberately go about it as a therapeutic endeavor? No, because it didn't occur to me to do that. But I think when I was actually delivering therapy, like I said before, I started introducing these wood carving techniques, but I could have just as easily brought in some knitting needles or a painting by numbers task or something, whatever it might have been. But the woodworking just happened to be my cup of tea. So I sort of fell into it that way. So yes, I used it for my own sort of well-being, but that wasn't necessarily a deliberate thing. I guess that, to be honest, that was probably that biophilic voice in my head guiding me towards doing that. But certainly now, as I reflect back, I can see that it was absolutely important to me, and my wife can tell you that as well. That my wife is. Dr. Corinne, she would prescribe shed time to me, where you would, well, I would have to go out in the shed and make something or whatever, and it's something that I still do now.
It's like this is episode 103, I think. Is what this one will be, or no, it'll be more than that. It'll be somewhere, it'll be more than 100 episodes. Anyway,
Yeah.
And I don't think I've had a guest on yet that didn't in some way or form say, yeah, this is my therapy, or I used it to get through a hard time, or something. And yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation to continue, and how bringing that, whether it's like the biophilic voice, or like the existential crisis of not being competent, or lack of self-efficacy, or wherever it's coming from, there is that, like you said, there is that draw towards being able to do things with your hands, and being able to capture that in a therapeutic setting, I think, is unique. Like, I don't know anybody who has a workbench in their office front, but I think when I set up a physical office, I might do that. This space here is going to be my home office, and I was going to put my hand tool bench back there with my hand tools on the wall as kind of like a good backdrop. But maybe when I'm doing like these Zoom therapy sessions, I'd be like, I'll just do my hand planing while you're doing that, while you're talking, and see how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely worth doing. I think back on my own journey as well. When I left the military, I like a lot of veterans do, and not only veterans, but people in other professions as well. People that transition into retirement or whatever it might be. It's a huge change in your life. So for me, I spent 20 years soldering. I didn't know anything else. Yes, I had a psychology degree, but that wasn't my life. I was an army officer, and all of a sudden that rug was pulled out from under me, and I was told by various medical professionals and the organisation for that matter that you can't do this anymore. And I'm like, well, what am I? Who am I? What can I? I don't know anything else other than this. So I had a very low start point, if that makes sense. And a lot of people do. I didn't have a plan B. So by picking up that hand plane and saying, well, I can't do that anymore. I can't be a soldier anymore. But you know what I can do? I can plane a piece of wood. I can turn that plain piece of wood into a box. I can turn that box into a jewelry box for my daughter, and we can build on that competence and proficiency from there. And you know what? If I can build a box, you know what else I can do? I can build a chair. I can build a Windsor chair. I can teach myself to do it. You know what? I can share that skill with other people as well. I can share my experiences outside of that with other people as well, and then it builds and cascades from there. So, that sense of accomplishment and competence and belief in yourself, it starts with those simple tasks, but it can absolutely build from there, and that is the benefit of it. That is that competence that it builds. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking we should probably wrap up. I do have a couple questions, more like process questions for how you actually do it.
Yeah.
But I think those are probably more appropriate for the after show, because it's pretty kind of niche questions, not necessarily general interest. So in our wrap up here, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate the talk, and it's been good and interesting, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Why don't you give yourself the plug for everything that you want to plug again before we wrap up here? Tell everybody where to find you, where they need to support you, what you need for support, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm all about spreading the word on this. As I said, I'm all about disseminating this knowledge and the experience that I have here. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have access to your listeners. And by the way, I absolutely admire and love what you do here, both not only with the podcast but your other work as well. I think it's absolutely wonderful. So I thank you for the opportunity. If people want to get in touch with me, The best place to do that is on Instagram, of which I have a love-hate relationship with for some of the reasons we just spoke about. But it's a wonderful tool to connect people, and I love connecting with people from all around the world. So I'd love to hear from people who have their own stories, and who want to exchange information, professionals who want to collaborate, or even individuals who want to share their own journeys. I'd love to hear from you. So I am at Halcyon Woodcraft on Instagram. That's Halcyon_Woodcraft_AU. So look me up, give me a follow. I keep that updated as best I can. I try not to be a slave to it though. So, I'm still, still adjusting it, but you can find me on there and absolutely reach out to me. Halcyon Woodcraft has also got a website as well. You can Google me, where I've got the upcoming workshops and programs that are on there. And the broader message I have for everybody who listens to this is to think about how, I assume that the majority of your listeners are woodworkers of some description. I'd encourage those woodworkers to maximize the well-being benefits. You don't need a clinical diagnosis to benefit out of this. Everybody can build their resilience through their woodworking. And some of these messages we've been talking about, some of the notes I've got in my fellowship report, which is available on the Churchill Fellowship website. Some of the information there can help you get a better understanding about how you can maximize your own well-being benefits of this. So I encourage you to think about that actively and listen to that biophilic voice.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll link your report in the show notes here for anybody who's interested in reading it as well. It's well worth the read, and it's not even too long. It's only 38 pages, so everybody can read that.
Hopefully, yeah.
But anyway, so thanks for coming on, and we'll any questions, comments, that type of stuff, leave them in the comment section of the systems that allow you to leave comments. And if you want to send an email to questions@workshops.therapypodcast.com, go ahead and do that. And with that, we'll head over to the after show.
Nice.
So now comes the thank you to the Founding Fathers and the plug for the Patreon membership. Your support means a lot. It doesn't just help keep the podcast going, but it helps build something that I genuinely believe matters. I don't want the show to just be about tools, projects, and maker chat. It's kind of the space where creativity, craftsmanship, mental health, it all comes together in a meaningful way. That was really demonstrated by this week's guest, Nev. And that's a part that, as a licensed therapist, it matters to me greatly. I've kind of dedicated my life to helping people work through struggle, find clarity, build healthier stories about who they are and how they live. And what makes this community special is that much of that same work also happens in the shop and around the bench, and through sharing these stories and sharing the process of what we do together, through the process of making and through the process of creativity. I believe there's something powerful about working with your hands while also learning how to work on yourself, again, as per our conversation with Nev today. So this is why your support, any support, whether you're a free member, just the $1 handshake tier, and the tiers where you get the pre and post show, those tiers, all of these tiers are not just necessarily about getting extra perks. They also, especially in the higher tiers, create room for a deeper conversation with like one-on-one consults with myself, or group meetings where we can kind of go on deeper or more private communication with each other to learn and to, again, provide that clarity and work through struggles and to build a healthier story for yourself. So if you'd like, honestly, some pretty cheap therapy sessions, feel free to join Patreon on the higher levels. Again, that kind of support helps make this podcast more than just entertainment. It helps make it a place where practical skill, reflection, and genuine encouragement can kind of come together outside the bounds and algorithms of social media. So again, thank you to the Founding Fathers for getting the podcast off the ground, and for all of you who still support, which is the most of you, I appreciate. So thank you, Matthew from Argiano Serio, Brad of Brad's Customs, Keith of Blackthorn Concepts, Eric of Overall Makerworks, and Brandon of Tectonic Creations. Thank you for backing this and still coming back every week or every month in such a meaningful and significant way. You're helping create a community where the value of making and the value of mental health are both tied together and taken seriously. I truly appreciate your support, and I'm honored to build this community with you. and with your support.